Yeah, so Bruchim Habaim. It's my honor and privilege to work with my colleague, Rabbi Phil Bressler. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Seidel, and I wanted to begin with a memorial moment for my teacher, inspiration, Rabbi Hanan Sills, Alav Shalom, passed away yesterday. Just to take a moment, a great rabbi, and a moment of reflection. Rabbi Sills was one of my important teachers, as I was saying before, an incredibly unique path, not linear, of creativity, of brilliance, tremendous skills in music, preaching, disorganized, organized, and a radical departure from the usual Reform movement rabbi of the early 1960s. Inspired by his Hillel at Rutgers, to become more Jewish and observant, inspired by his teachers at Hebrew Union College to study Jewish philosophy, eventually going into the chaplaincy in the Navy for 2 years, and then a big congregation in Milwaukee, where he was then at a rabbinic conference in 1964, decided to go with 20 rabbis to support Dr. King. Got arrested with Dr. King in St. Augustine, Florida. Was in jail for a week. Interviewed by the papers, got out, and half his congregation supported him and half did not. And the half that did not smashed his car and windows of his home. Oh. So Jews not supporting the civil rights movement, a story that I heard today for the first time. So half the congregation is split over his actions to support Dr. King. So I want us to notice that not everybody in the Jewish world supported the civil rights movement in the early 60s. I was a kid then. And my parents marched for civil rights in the early 60s. So did I. I was like 7 or 8 years old. But Rabbi Sills was very courageous. He was a remarkable musician. His 2 uncles were performers on Broadway and vaudeville. So I learned that today. He grew up with these 2 uncles that were singers, pianists, accordion, real showmen. And he was a showman, a fantastic tenor, cantorial training, incredible, beautiful voice, like with striking tenor. Commanded and could sing the liturgy in a way that would arrest you, like a great cousin, right? Dropped out, became Hillel rabbi at UT Austin. Got turned on by the students to LSD and drugs. Became very creative in new rituals and new programming for students. Then went to Boulder for a few years as the rabbi at Hillel and CU, University of Colorado. Experimenting, meeting new people around the country in Jewish renewal, ecological action, feminism. When I met him in 1980, he was doing new rituals for bar mitzvah, leading outdoor Sufi rituals, doing wild and crazy things in the mountains. He had dropped out. He was living with his kids on land. Extremely creative, often unpredictable, and a chaotic life in many ways. A life that he chose to live, or chose him, I'm not sure, but it was a complicated human being, but with streaks of real brilliance and creativity. Did not fit into the rabbinic organizations, as you can imagine. Unconventional, brilliant, difficult sometimes, but an inspiration. And then got his doctorate, was teaching at the University of Oregon for years, founded the Hillel at University of Oregon, and started the Jewish Studies program at the University of Oregon. Both. Jewish Studies professor and Hillel rabbi. Built both programs until they were taken over by other people and more money. Built the Hillel House at the University of Oregon. Had a major impact in the Eugene community. Joined a moshav in 1983 that I was invited to join, which was a Jewish collective socialist moshav of artists called Shiftei Shalom in Dorina Lake, Oregon. And Hanan joined that community. I was called to join. I was in Berkeley, but I could not join. And Hanan joined with a number of other families, and that was a very creative arts community. It fell apart they disagreed over its future. So within a few years, it fell apart. It's actually the second socialist experiment in Jewish history in Oregon, because 1878, you had the new Odessa community in Roseburg, which was founded by young Jews from Russia, 17 and 18-year-old people, about 30 of them came. young couples, and they're teenagers from Russia, came to near Roseburg, Oregon, and founded a moshav kibbutz, a collective, and that fell apart in about 10 years. They moved on to San Francisco. That was the first, and this, as far as I know, was the second, 1982 to 86. It was called Shiftei Shalom.
And where was it?
It was near Darina Lake. Do you know Cottage Grove, Oregon?
No.
Everybody know Cottage Grove? Okay. Go down from Eugene, 20 miles from Eugene south. Turn left. Go up the highway 10 miles. You're at Darina Lake. It's very pretty. And there are a number of farms there. It's not far from here, actually. Right? Depending upon 2 hours. So really great place. And then Hanan was the spiritual leader of that for a while. But I also got very interested in his view of philosophy, and so I wanted to talk about his view of that, and also my rabbi and others that were influenced by Eugene Borowitz. Eugene Borowitz is probably the primary Reform Jewish theologian of the 20th century for about 50 years. He just died about 5 years ago. Rabbi Professor Borowitz was an amazing philosopher who wrote articles on autonomous philosophy and mitzvah, how mitzvah is grounded in autonomy. So I thought I would go to Buber on that too, because Buber was about autonomy, and talk about briefly what does the concept of autonomy mean in Jewish law for about 5 minutes. We're going to study a little philosophy, and then we're going to get to Rabbi Phil has brought some sources.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, actually,
which will back up.
One sheet for because actually the first source, because this was something I wanted to make sure I covered too, was the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy definition of heteronomy.
So the issue is freedom and autonomy tonight, of accepting mitzvot or not accepting them, the capacity to choose mitzvot in us, in our souls and our neshamas. Last time we talked about the soul. What is it about human behavior that are we truly free to accept a system of law upon ourselves? Self-obligation is autonomy. Heteronomy is when it's imposed from without by a commander. You don't have choice, which we're going to get to the midrash on that tonight, which is an important midrash. The rabbis wrestle with all these questions. So we're also going to discuss whether there was a different tone to accepting a moral system in antiquity, and by the time of Kant, how does that shift? The notion of autonomy then is accepting something upon yourself of obligation. That's autonomy. You could believe the commandments are external to you, but you have the freedom to accept, and you choose which mitzvot to accomplish and to do. So autonomy is you somehow create a congruency between your soul's desires and a system that you accept upon yourself as autonomy. So I believe all liberal Jews today, Reform conservative, renewal, Reconstructionist, and many Orthodox really are living by a system of autonomy rather than heteronomy of our ancestors, which I believe is related to tribal morality. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Anthropologists that study law, how legal systems developed in the ancient world. So autonomy then is, Eugene Borowitz wrote an essay on the autonomous Jewish self, I think in the 70s. I'll read it to you. Borowitz argues the autonomous Jewish self is a tolerant and sensitive person able to respond to the conflicting needs of Jewish law and personal conscience. I'll say that again. Instead of Borowitz does not agree that autonomy is the imposition of an objective law. Rather, the autonomous self is a tolerant and sensitive person able to respond to the conflicting needs of Jewish law and personal conscience, which is closer to Martin Buber. Conscience and presence allow us to take on a mitzvah, whatever that mitzvah is. Now, what's the difference between I feel like doing something, I feel like it, feel good, and a sense of autonomous obligation of a legal system? We're going to talk about that. Because Americans, the critique of liberal Judaism by Orthodox is, they're just doing what feels good. And it's superficial. And it's really meaningless because it has to do with impulsive notions of feeling good. So we're going to discuss that tonight. I hope we can unpack that.
Absolutely.
The rabbis we're going to unpack this feel-good thing and the acceptance of an autonomous legal system upon oneself. Buber was an antinomian. He rejected the orthodoxy of his grandfather and parents. Martin Buber, although he was raised by his grandfather. Martin Buber becomes the most important Jewish philosopher, I think, in the 20th century. Heschel being a very close second. Certainly, we'd have to talk about Rosenzweig, his notion of mitzvah we will in this class. But Martin Buber's antinomianism influenced much of liberal Judaism, but Borowitz takes it into action, what we would call authenticity. When does taking on a law or a mitzvah become authentic? Now, for St. Paul, may he rest in peace, Shaul of Tarsus, he says, once you've screwed up one mitzvah, once you've screwed up one thing, it leads you to death, and you need something to rescue you from the death of your soul that the law imposes upon you. So God gave the Torah, in the sense of mitzvah, to create this scenario of spiritual death, which requires who? In his lovely system. Jesus is the solution to the problem that God creates in Romans and Corinthians. Very clever, right? So for Paul, the mitzvah, once you screw up, leads you to sin and death. And then to be rescued from that, you need the Christ. The rabbis say, no, where did you come up with that scenario? That makes no sense. Nobody's expected to keep all 613 mitzvot perfectly. If you sin in one, you make tshuva. You repair what you did wrong. You confess, you change. Yes, the possibility of change, repair, and fixing your life. But Paul says, he creates this scenario that I don't think Jesus said, which is that once you screw up one, you've created a situation where you were living with sin and thereby with death, and then need to be brought to life by the coming of the Christ. So you see, it's a built-in
sort of like when you blow your diet. You're like, I ate the chocolate.
Exactly.
Bar. It's all.
I ate one chocolate, and my diet is blown.
But like the most
and then you go to hell. Everything just like let it go. This idea, just let it go, right?
Right.
So this either-or idea in St. Paul is very unhealthy. It's also a very radical misreading of our Torah and the rabbis, in my opinion. Although people now argue that Paul's closer to Rabbinic Judaism, that's a whole nother evening when we take a look at Romans. But the idea that the law leads to death and needs to have the Christ, we reject that out of hand. We reject that idea that when you screw up a mitzvah, it doesn't mean you throw out the entire system of mitzvah that you've taken on. So autonomy for Borowitz comes out of Kant. In Kant, in the ground of the metaphysics of morals, claims there's two claims in Borowitz's and Kantian idea. One is that, number one, we are moral agents and able to choose. We are agents of morality, number one. And this is Kenneth Seeskin's rereading of Borowitz. Two, every moral action is self-reflective.
What is self-reflective?
That you're consciously taking on something. It's a self-reflection, and it's part of the building of yourself. Your self-fashioning is built one mitzvah at a time, one choice of a moral action. So Borowitz, and like many people after Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, want to make Judaism congruent with Kantianism. What does Kant say? We choose moral actions as rational beings. Our highest self is a rational being able to choose. And tonight we'll talk a little bit about the issue of free will. Is there really free will, or is it illusionary? But for Kant, we are rational beings making choices about our moral actions, whether it's to take our Torah or part of it. And then what constitutes a moral action? That's a whole other philosophical problem. What constitutes morality? But Kant is very revolutionary in some ways, and yet Kant was a Christian and understood somehow his Christianity was linked to following a moral path. But he creates Christianity as a moral, rational choice. So we can resonate with that. And the guy that most exemplified Kant in the Jewish world is named Hermann Cohn, who was a great German Jewish philosopher. Most people not heard. I just finished teaching a whole class on Hermann Cohn. One of the great influences for me. post-Kantian. Judaism is grounded in, he wrote, the religion of Judaism, das Religion des Judentum aus the Ursprung des religion of Judaism out of the wellsprings of reason. It's kind of a Kantian reading of Judaism. And what does he argue in that book? Fantastic book. He argues that all of us can aspire to live our higher selves and make rational choices in a republic of democracy. Hermann Cohen promoted democracy as a rational. This is what he wanted for Germany. He wanted choosing citizens who are moral and rational to create a republic of reason. Now, we can have a long debate tonight whether human beings are actually rational. It's apparently not. After World War I, a lot of Kant's rationality was rejected when people saw the results on the battlefield. They saw war for war's sake. They saw millions dead. After World War I, a lot of the Kantian optimism, including Hermann Cohen's book, the last book that he wrote posthumously, was rejected by thinkers who really saw that the whole illusion of human reason was actually a big mistake. We're not actually rational. So that's another part of the talk. How can we, as irrational human beings, create a system of rationality? American Republic right now looks like it's actors of non-reason and irrational behaviors, in my opinion. But yes,
we're not pre-World War I belief that we could always be rational afterward. Not always.
Right.
We could be rational, but we're not always rational.
Simply said, yes. World War I created a caesura in this belief system, a radical change after the First World War. And then you have the Dadaist movement, and you have a new kind of romantic, cynical movement in art and poetry and in dance. And so after the First World War, a lot of this 19th century optimism was thrown out the window. My grandfather inherited more of the 19th century, and I used to talk to him about that human beings are progressing rationally towards a good end, and anything that is built into certain systems of post-Kantian thinking, that we do have a rational humanity making free choices from their highest rational selves. So Hermann Cohen aspired to build a democracy of rational human beings living a life of ethical behaviors. He was I would say, fit within the Reform movement, but was traditional in his own practice. Hermann Cohen, a great book that he wrote. And it's worth considering today. Is it possible to live an ethical, rational choice as human beings? Or must we adopt the religion of our ancestors, which was more heteronomous? So what's heteronomy? Heteronomy would be an imposed legal system. At Mount Sinai, it was imposed on us. Na'aseh v'nishma. We did it, and then we explained it afterwards. And the rabbis had a hard time with what's called I forgot the word, savara shel mitzvot, the reason? The reasons of this, what's the word for the rationale?
I'm going to call it ta'ameh.
Ta'ameh ha-mitzvah, right. So svara or ta'ameh ha-mitzvah, they had a hard time with that the commandments could be explained rationally. Maimonides is the first one to really promote that, and then others did. The idea that kashrut is rational in some way. You choose kashrut because it points to has a rational meaning, when in fact it probably isn't. The system of ethics in the Torah is kedoshim tehiyu. You should be holy. It doesn't say you shall be rational choosing human beings. It doesn't say you shall be good human beings, as Plato would say, as the Greeks would say, seek the good and do it, right? Plato, which then becomes an important part of the medieval tradition, Aristotelian. You achieve excellence through the good. Plato and Aristotle mixed together. So the idea that the idea is kedoshim tehiyu, be holy, follow God. We said right in Leviticus, right? Be holy, as the Lord your God is holy. Ki ani Hashem kadosh, right? I am holy, you should be holy. So that's very different than saying be rational, choosing human beings, choosing a system of ethics that creates for an ethical society. Very different. And I want us to acknowledge that in the Bible. And Rabbi Phil's we're going to get to that in the sources, because a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about tonight is already implicit in rabbinic sources and certainly medieval sources. So I think that's enough. I encourage you to read Borowitz's article on the autonomous choosing self, and any article on Kant's influence on modern Judaism, which is immense. American Republic is founded as a Kantian in many ways. The founders founded our country as a separation of church and state, as a rational republic, very Kantian in its aspirations, and yet the mixing of faith and civic religion continues in some interesting ways.
But didn't the founders also say that it would only work if you had a moral populace?
Right.
Implying they're following some form of
That's
religion.
right. That's right. And what's the basis of that is part of the debate in our country today.
Sure.
What's the basis of morality? I recognize atheists in this congregation and in Eugene or anywhere in America who live a moral life. Atheists, on what grounds? So, right, as a religious Jew, I would like to know in dialogue with an atheist, what is the grounding of your morality? Okay, and we all know atheists that live a good life, sometimes better than religious people. Yes,
Yeah.
you would acknowledge that. Okay,
Absolutely.
half my relatives are religious, half are not, roughly, of my own family.
Yeah.
So, how does a morality not grounded in faith work? Okay, so that's another. So I'm going to leave it there, and then we're going to jump in. So
Can I actually ask you?
Yeah, sure.
I flagged a couple of questions that came up for me.
Of course.
Because this is my chance to learn from you too. So one of the first things you said about what Borowitz wrote there was about conflicting needs of Jewish law and personal conscience.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I understand the needs of Jewish law, oddly enough, and what it demands. Like, do you have that whole sentence, or can you find it?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, but I'm trying to think of what are those conflicting, like, what could my conscience need that my obedience to Jewish law would have a problem with,
Yeah. Here, the autonomous Jewish self is a tolerant and sensitive person able to respond to the conflicting needs of Jewish law and personal conscience. Jewish law having a need for you to behave a certain way, and your conscience having a way.
So, what's an example? Yes, that's what I'm trying to.
For me, it was 1972. The country was telling me to enlist in the draft. I had my draft card. I was ready to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
And the country said, "Go to Vietnam."
Sure. And so
I said no, and I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I thought it was an unjust war.
And Jewish law would obligate you because the law of the king is the law.
Follow the law of the land. And my father said, "It's not your war." My dad said, "Go to Canada." To give you 1973 for me. Chabad came after. Chabad, Vietnam, Israel, or college. Those were my four choices.
Okay.
4 choices in 1973.
All right, now I understand.
You understand?
Yeah,
so in other words, if
I think it was the word
halachic,
that I was.
if there's a halachic obligation that bothers my conscience, and we could enumerate
I'm sure that
many, including
Okay.
eating kosher foods in a market that you wouldn't call food. There are kosher products of synthesized things that you would look at and go, "What is that?"
Okay.
It's awful, and it shouldn't be kosher, but it has an OU stamp on it because some rabbi put a stamp on it. You know what I'm talking about. Food that's not food, okay?
Highly processed.
Highly processed crap. And you're not obligated to. It's kosher, right? But we can come up with many.
Yeah, okay.
And then also deals with the issue of the law and ethics. When halakha conflicts with ethical
which is
system.
actually a lot of what we're doing
We're
here.
going to do a lot about
I guess that's probably a good question to leave sitting in the room for later. Then is we acknowledge Jewish law has needs and our personal consciousness have needs, and those are two sources of morality. But like you were sort of just saying, where does the personal conscience? What's the anchor there? Like where does that come from?
Yeah, and right, and to give a nicer term to what feels good. When is conscience a refined conscience, and when is it just doing what I feel is good,
right,
or right at the moment because it feels good? Okay. So that's going to come up a lot in contemporary discussion of Jewish law and legal systems and halakha, and Yeah. But any more
I was also
questions?
curious, you mentioned authenticity, which
Yes.
struck me as a compelling term, but not one I'd heard about. I mean, like,
That's,
I think I know what it means. Is that something you feel like talking more about?
well, for me, it was an important term because I was reading Heidegger and Sartre and all the existentialists when I was in college. And
It seems like a technical term here.
authenticity
Okay.
comes out of
What
content
does it mean?
philosophy.
Okay.
The 19th century, it's grounded really further by Heidegger. The authentic beingness of being. And authenticity, it's a whole 2-hour lecture. But aligning your higher self with all of your action, resonating your conscience with your higher self. We could discuss, Heidegger's problem was that his authentic notion of himself and as a German was to be a Nazi. Well, that's a problem for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was also a problem for other Germans. Okay, so Heidegger's, your notion of authenticity, I assume, Rabbi, was to actually enter the rabbinate.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
And to be a father.
Yeah.
And to be a spouse.
Sure.
All that, authentically living that life.
Mhm.
Meaning, is it congruent with your soul? Is it congruent? So that's the existentialist.
Got it. Okay.
Sartre, Heidegger, Husserl has this whole teaching about authenticity. That's back in the 40s to 30s, 40s, 50s.
That sounds like it.
And it's a technical term in philosophy.
Yeah.
We would say a vocation that's authentic for us fits our soul, right? Those are the job that you're called to, your profession, your vocation, if that's authentically lived out. And there's much more to say. So,
it sounds like that describes what Borowitz is, the
Yes.
sort of tension he's describing in between conflicting needs of Jewish law and personal conscience, the sensitive, reflective person, whatever it was, is the authentic one is the one who could find that balance in a way that they can live into.
Like our colleagues that are eating
Sure.
vegan.
Sure.
They are authentically living a vegan life because that's what they resonate with in terms of their ethical system, not killing animals.
Sure.
And people that eat beef that's not kosher by Orthodox law, but like myself, but grass-fed, healthy, happy cows. That's an authentic halakhic choice based on congruence. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Did I explain that? Okay. All right.
I wouldn't call it halakhic, but
No.
it's authentic.
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
I would argue it is a halacha. I'm under the influence of some of my colleagues who postulate that there's really not one path, but there are many different authentic paths.
Sounds like
it is
Boston.
an authentic path.
Yes.
But
we're gonna good question though. What is considered halakha today?
yeah, that's a
whole
other.
really interesting. Good. You opened a can of joy.
Okay.
Can of joy.
So, you got sources in front of you, and folks who are either watching live or on video can look in the comments to the video for the link to the various source sheets. I made sure to put front and center the definition I pulled from the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, freely available on the internet, of autonomy and heteronomy, because I feel like autonomy is a word I use sometimes.
Well, this is great.
But I don't think I've ever used the term heteronomy in any sort of daily conversation. But you already sort of did the work of defining it. I sort of bolded the key parts here.
Excellent.
Autonomy is the capacity of self-government. Agents are autonomous if their actions are truly their own. It's essential for Kant, and some of this other stuff we're gonna get into. The difficulty in the concept is our desires, choices, and our actions are all partly caused by factors outside of our control, including those factors originally responsible for our characters. Getting at, the idea that we are, to a certain extent, I guess, enslaved by our desires. We have desires to eat and drink and procreate and all those kind of things. We may think that we are choosing when, what we eat or how we eat or when we eat, but we're also driven by something that's not necessarily just our own choosing. So we'll examine those concepts a bit. And agents that are heteronomous, if their will is under the control of another, and that's the another in this that we're going to explore is mostly for most relevantly for Jews, God, but in the direction that takes us into outside of Jewish spheres, it's also it's both human biology and things of that nature. So, and it should be noted that the pair is not exhaustive. An agent may fail to be autonomous because of external factors that don't include control by another, but other kinds of constraint and compulsion. I think that's what they're getting at, that it's possible to be neither autonomous nor heteronomous in decision making. I think that's what that's getting at. Or some sort of mix of both, perhaps if you're somehow compelled, which could become relevant towards the end of this year. Okay, so we established last session that what makes a human being, what makes a person, right? Lowercase p person, an uppercase p person, as distinct from merely an animal is, and therefore deserving of a particular kind of moral consideration, is possession of three souls, as Abraham Ibn Ezra pointed it out. Nefesh, which is our sort of animal soul that desires food and happiness and sex and things like that. Ruach, which is slightly higher than that, and this maps onto Freud's id-ego, superego. This is like the ego, the higher levels, higher level desires like self-mastery, honor, glorification, those kind of things. And our neshama, our special super-added human souls that give us the ability to reason, give us wisdom, the ability to speech and utilize language. We checked out the rabbinic explication in Tractate Nida that, which is sort of a proto-scientific, almost like a pre-scientific assessment that, we get our body parts. The red stuff comes from our mothers and the white stuff comes from our fathers. And that's what we get from our parents, but God is the one that adds the souls, which count for things like the diversity of our appearance, our sensory capabilities, movement, speech, all that kind of stuff. So in terms of what makes a person, we established last time, is that reflective structure of human consciousness. We can think about what we do or don't do. We're not totally subject to our desires the way animals are. And personhood as a concept is important to halachic discussions and in halachic decision making because it raises questions that define the parameters of our moral obligations, which is where all of this is headed. And I would say they define the parameters of our moral obligations, both, I'd say, kind of externally from the standpoint of what we can't do or not, what we can do or not do to another capital P person, and also internally what we as persons ourselves can, internally considering only for ourselves do or not do. Like kashrut would be an example. Right. That doesn't affect anyone but me. Okay. So this all leads into one of I think the ramifications of personhood, which is this problem of autonomy, or often described as the problem of free will. I noticed you put free won't up there too. Yeah. Which implies you have the option to choose whether to do or not something. Do or not do something. I like that. I hadn't heard it before, but
my friend Sky Pellicro, may he live and be well, gave that to me. Said he learned it from a Buddhist.
Oh, well. Free
won't.
Sure, absolutely. Choosing not to do something is still choosing. Okay, so since animals can't, by their nature, their lack of neshama in our schema can't go about reasoning and choosing whether or how to act on their desires, they are not persons, and they're therefore not subject to the same moral consideration that capital P persons are. There's a whole diversion possible here into what we ought not to do or ought to do to non-person animals, not where we're headed today. But additionally, since animals can't reason, we can't hold them responsible for our actions here. There would be another really interesting diversion into the goring ox laws in the Torah, or things of that nature, where it describes animals who like oxen who gore somebody, like who kill somebody with their horns, are stoned, to death. But in the rabbinic explanation of that, it gets into details about, well, has the ox been known to gore before? Like, is this just sort of them acting, almost a crime of passion, like they were somehow agitated, or is this a habit of theirs? Almost sort of getting into, without quite saying, is this animal morally responsible for its actions? Kind of hinting at that. Is this an animal we should know, gores or not? So animals, and generally speaking, can't be held responsible. It's assumed that the ox is totally, enslaved to its desires. Nonetheless, it's stoned not because not essentially as a punishment for doing wrong, but because of the danger it poses. That's why it's goring habit is the issue. Is this going to endanger another person? We need to stone it to death. Okay. Persons, on the other hand, can be held morally responsible for their actions, and so punishments built into legal structures become effective in terms of guiding their behavior, and it enables the legal systems that involve punishment for crimes. Or can they?
So if the ox wasn't responsible for its goring behavior, wouldn't you stone the owner who let it run loose? Instead of the
ultimately, that's what it gets into. Is if a person, then it's negligence,
And then
and
damages.
they're liable for
Damages.
damages.
Yeah. We don't execute. We throw people in jail who have vicious dogs that are not under control. You actually can go to jail for that in many countries, right?
Right.
I don't know for long, but you are held responsible for if it kills somebody, your dog, you can go to jail for that.
Right.
But they execute the dog, just like they executed the goring ox.
Okay.
So
But the idea is you're only responsible for your ox if you somehow made an immoral decision with it. If it just acts of its own accord out of the blue, you've done nothing wrong. You had no way of anticipating that. You're not going to be liable.
Okay.
More than likely for damages.
You didn't sick the dog on somebody.
Probably. I mean, this is all explored in Ezekiel.
Right.
There's ins and outs all over the place. And case law. Okay. So in theory, persons should be who are able to make decisions can be held morally responsible. We're working with a baseline assumption that you can only be held responsible if you had a choice in the matter. Animals have no choice because they're incapable of choosing. Humans, in theory, are capable of choosing. But their moral responsibility and whether or not they're liable for their choices can be mitigated if there was no choice for them to make. Either because they were, like it says here, constrained somehow, or if some other factor, someone or something else was overly involved in that, compelling them and not really allowing them full autonomy. That's getting at the gist of these definitions here. So we'll look today at how the problem of free will and whether we are really autonomous, or if there are, to what extent there are external sources imposing upon us and our ability to choose, how that plays out in biblical and rabbinic sources. Okay. So biblical monotheism basically subordinates the entire natural world to God's sovereign power. I probably don't need a proof text to prove that to you, but I'm going to bring you one anyway because it just hits the nail directly on the head here. We'll go around the room and read some of these out loud. Could you read source number 2 for us, Rachel?
Whatever the Lord desires, God does in heaven and earth, in the seas and all the depths. God makes clouds rise from the end of the earth. God makes lightning for the rain. God releases the wind from God's vaults.
So this is Psalms 135. Really nails it here. Whatever God desires in heaven and earth, that's what happens. Natural phenomenon, the seas, the clouds, the lightning, the rain, the wind, all that kind of stuff. The entire world is subject to God's sovereign power. That's, for the most part, taken for granted within biblical theology. We would expect, therefore, that necessarily includes humans, too. That includes human psychology. And actually, this is a very apropos example because this is last week's Torah portion. God even gets involved in human psychology, directs individual behavior periodically. Could we keep going around the room and read source number 3 there from Parashat Bo last week? This will be real familiar. Yeah.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these my signs among them, and that you may recount in the hearing of your sons and of your sons' sons how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and how I displayed my signs among them, in order that you may know that I am the Lord."
So this is, I think I've heard a variation of this drash, countless times of how could God do that? How could God harden Pharaoh's heart, because it really makes it sound like God is getting involved here and making Pharaoh's choice for him, somehow using God's sovereign power over the universe to make Pharaoh do what God wants and achieve God's purpose, which is ultimately to display signs to the Egyptians, so that everyone will know that God is God, right? It presents a real moral difficulty here, because Pharaoh and the Egyptians are clearly punished for this. Yet it seems like perhaps Pharaoh was not an autonomous decision maker. Right. There was some heteronomy going on, and God was making Pharaoh's decisions for him. The converse is actually also true. So God intervenes a number of times. Here's one example. It happens again in Deuteronomy. I think Sichon, the God hardens an enemy king's heart. It happens in Joshua as well. I didn't bring all of those because that was more than enough, but it does happen numerous times. Interestingly, the converse also happens. So God makes people, hardens their heart and makes them do the wrong thing. God also makes people do the right thing. There's an example here. Susan, you'll read source number 4 from Genesis chapter 20.
Okay.
Please.
Abraham journeyed from there to the region of Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While he was sojourning in Gerar, Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She's my sister." So King Abimelech of Gerar had Sarah brought to him.
Thinking, obviously, this is an unmarried woman. I can court her and marry her without any consequence. If she was married, that would be an issue. But Abraham said, "She's my sister." So, okay, go ahead.
But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are to die because of the woman that you have taken, for she is a married woman." No, Abimelech had not approached her. He said, "O Lord, will you slay people even though innocent?" He himself said to me, "She is my sister." And she also said, "He is my brother." When I did this, my heart was blameless and my hands were clean. And God said to him in the dream, "I knew that you did this with a blameless heart, and so I kept you from sinning against me. That was why I did not let you touch her."
Mm-hmm. So here, Abimelech is like, "Well, how was I supposed to know?" And God says, "Yes, you were right. You had no idea, and so I did not let you touch her." It sounds like God is intervening here for the good, to prevent someone from sinning. Right. So it actually goes both ways. There are examples all over of God intervening in human psychology and exercising God's absolute control over the universe to essentially manipulate people.
Right. This is
yeah.
It's an interesting case, but it's a very interesting case.
So the harden my heart thing I came up with right away. I was like, oh yeah, I know one of those. But the opposite one, I mean, I knew the story, but I forgot that was an element of it.
The Chazakti et libo is the idea that the Midrash is after 5 stubborn refusals, his heart becomes hardened of his own behavior.
Right.
And the Rambam has this whole thing about how you.
So eventually, it is justified.
It's reflexive. If you do enough sins repeatedly, you've gotten into the groove of sinning.
Sure.
So you've hardened your own heart. It's a very delicate balance between God hardening.
Yeah, they do a lot of.
So isn't that God's?
They do a lot of work to justify the plagues. Yeah. Okay. On the other hand, in Deuteronomy and elsewhere, Deuteronomy, actually, I think you wrote. Oh, it is
chapter 30.
Yeah, chapter 30. Oh, I wrote the wrong thing in my notes. That was why
chapter 30.
I was confused. Deuteronomy chapter 30, 15 to 20. The Deuteronomist emphasizes the crucial significance of human choice vis-a-vis the mitzvot. Right. Adam, do you mind reading there, chapter 20? This should hopefully strike you as familiar. It's pretty stirring language.
Okay. See, I set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in God's ways, and to keep God's commandments, God's laws, and God's rules, that you may thrive and increase, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land that you are about to enter and possess. But if your heart turns away, and you give no heed, and are lured into the worship and service of other gods, I declare to you this day that you shall certainly perish. You shall not long endure on the soil that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, if you and your offspring would live, by loving the Lord your God, heeding God's commandments, and holding fast to God. For thereby you shall have life, and shall long endure upon the soil that the Lord swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them.
So this seems directly in tension with what we just read. Whereas we established that God has the ability to decide when people sin or not, here essentially the opposite seems to be true. And the most essential thing that God needs from humanity is our choice. God sets out the choice, life and death, blessing and curse, encourages us to choose life so that we can endure, which involves loving the Lord your God. And note here, love in biblical Hebrew doesn't mean romantic love in the same way that we understand it, but it's really it's a legal relationship. It's care and fealty and loyalty to someone. A husband loving his wife is feeding and taking care of and clothing her more than love in the sense that we know love. So loving and being attached to God, essentially, heeding God's commandments, doing the mitzvot, and holding fast to God. That's what God, it seems like, needs us to choose. The Tanakh itself makes no attempt to harmonize this, to harmonize these two ideas with one another. The individual moral freedom that Deuteronomy requires, and God's ultimate control that we see in numerous other places.
Right.
It essentially just affirms both. These are both true.
So how do we think about free will and obedience?
Well, yeah, that's like the whole rest of what we're talking about.
That's our whole class. Next week.
Yeah.
The Eved Hashem is. See, Eved Hashem?
Yes.
Servant of the Lord. What does it mean to be a servant of the Lord? Are you a slave to God? And what does the slave have any choice, right?
So we're setting up for a bit of that as how to.
Abdullah, one of the most important Arabic names for a Muslim boy, is Eved Hashem, is a servant of the Lord, right? I serve the Lord. Am I a slave to God? How is slavery congruent with free will?
That's a good question.
So there's your problem.
That's exactly the problem the rabbis had, is they read all of this, and for them, they took it for granted that all of it was true. They had no attempt internally within the Tanakh to harmonize it, so it put them in a tough spot of wanting to emphasize human moral responsibility, but at the same time without compromising God's absolute power in the universe. Like, if God can just make our choices for us, why doesn't God do that? Why the need to choose? Like, this is clearly a tough spot. So the rabbis taught essentially a doctrine of freedom and free will that's, and I'm going to take it from the sources I read who make this claim much more convincingly than I do personally, taught a doctrine of freedom that's roughly equivalent to the relative free will theory found in ancient Greek philosophy. I hope that means something to you. Essentially, it walks the line in between these two things. And so there's a couple examples I brought today to show how the rabbis navigated this tension. Let's see, where are we back around? Oh, we're on you, Rabbi.
Well, yes. Hakol tzapui v'arashut netuna b'tov ha'olam nidon. Hakol lefi rov ha'maaseh. Rabbi Akiva used to say, everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted. Aha. And the world is judged with goodness, and everything is in accordance with the preponderance of works.
This is, perhaps very frustratingly underexplained. Pirkei Avot is just these pithy quotes. What does it mean? Everything is foreseen.
That's a very famous quote.
Freedom of choice is granted. I mean, any takes on it? How would you make sense? Can you?
God knows how we're going to freely choose. That's how.
That's one explanation.
God knows.
God knows how we will freely choose.
Yes,
we can see into the future and see how we will freely choose. He's not forcing the choice, but he can see.
Yes.
It's like he gets a sneak preview, so to speak.
That's one way of making sense.
As opposed to Calvin.
Yes.
Calvin would say, you apparently have free choice, but it's predestined what you're doing, and it's predestined where you're ending up too, right? Your destination is known to God a priori. And John Calvin, Luther is slightly different than that, a little bit different. But here you've got it's just very pithy,
Right.
It's sapui is a great term. Sopheh, right? The tzadifeh, it's a great term to scout. God scouts out, as Rachel says, he scouts out what's going to happen, but he still gives you the illusion, as Philo would say.
So that I would say that's
Illusion of free will.
slightly different.
That's different. Rachel would say you have categorical free will.
Well,
At least that's what I heard.
I don't know that we've categorical. I mean, we've already said that it may be subject to, maybe your subconscious mind, this. But God is not forcing the choice.
That's
God is not intervening to force the choice.
God knows the outcome.
Right.
And perhaps and perhaps directs the consequences, but doesn't make the choice for you.
That's right.
Whereas you're saying you use the word illusion, which implies to me that God is sort of making our choice for us, but doesn't let on.
We're marionettes.
And we just think we have free will. What a depressing philosophy.
Well, that's false.
I mean, why do these people
as
even
far as I
bother
know,
living?
Putin is manipulating my Facebook page. I think I have a really independent Facebook, but I might not.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I might not because the Russians are way smarter than me, correct?
No, I disagree.
I'm just joking. I don't know the extent of Russian interference on Facebook. I don't know. I can imagine. I don't think it's very much at all. But the illusion of free will.
Sure. So that's another.
Philo of Alexandria says it's an illusionary thing. We just think we have free will, but we're either deluded or it's an illusion.
I think Freud says as well.
Yes. Yes.
So, one example there. There's another really wonderful quote here in Brachot 33b. It's my turn. I'll read source number 7 from the Gemara. Rabbi Chanina said, "Rabbi Chanina, hakol bidei shamayim, chutz miyirat shamayim." So everything is in the hands of heaven, except for fear of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Does fear of heaven mean anything to you? That's a term the Gemara uses all the time. Literally fear of heaven with a sense of obligation to the commandments, a sense of beholdenness to them, sense of obligation to them.
Yeah.
One does the mitzvot because you are not exactly fear is an afraid, but fear is an awe, more like a sense of the overwhelming majesty of God, and then I have to obey.
There you go.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So Rabbi Chanina seems like he's saying everything is in God's hands, except that sense of awe of God that we have, and our sense of whether we allow that to compel us to do the mitzvot, and we choose to do them, or we don't. Seems to be saying something similar to what Rabbi Akiva used to say, and this is what I'm getting at as the sort of relative free will theory, which I understand to be taught in Greek philosophy, but I'm not enough of an expert to go point out those sources for you. Basically, God predetermines that you have deliberative choice. We're because we're still created beings, God must have created us in such a way that we have the ability to choose, but determines, even such things as our brain's mode of operation, determines perhaps our natures, our predilections, and things like that, and potentially controls also all of the results of our choices.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still some element of autonomy, some element of choosing. And this is basically how the rabbis try to thread the needle in between Deuteronomy and some of the other.
The Greeks go into this notion that we talked last time, the nous. When you're totally aligned with your higher self, the noetic of higher consciousness, that is God working through you. So that's an attunement, it's an alignment that the Greeks speak about. And then Middle Platonists and Philo as well. And that gets into Rabbinic Judaism to some extent in the Middle Ages. We can talk about that. An alignment with the noetic. So that the nous leads to the nomos. The law emerges out of this alignment in Greek philosophy. Nomos, law. So then we have is that heteronomy or is that autonomy? But go ahead.
Right. So the consequence is essentially that it successfully threads the needle, but it doesn't get all the way clear that it's possible still that if God is really responsible for everything that makes us us, God's essentially we may not be fully autonomous in that sense. That may put us over the line into heteronomy, in which case God is in some ways ultimately responsible for our either moral delinquency or our positive moral behavior. And therefore, in as much as there are divine punishments for violation of the mitzvot, also then responsible for our punishment. God essentially creates us in such a way that we screw up so that God can punish us, which means God punishes us. We never really had it. So this is still potentially problematic.
Well, that goes back to St. Paul.
Right, exactly.
The system
right.
is set up so
you can sort of see how he got there.
He gets there from there, and then he needs the solution, which he provides the remedy for the sickness of sin and death through the Christ.
Right.
So you can see how that.
Whereas the rabbinic answer is essentially not that God created us to be sort of sin machines that need redemptions. We're created to be tshuva machines.
That's nice.
Yeah,
can I quote you?
Teshuva as in repentance. Where we're created in such a way that it's taken for granted that we're going to screw up and sin. But the remedy for that is not, not the need for salvation. It's that we do teshuva. We're also given the ability to realize our wrongdoing, seek to remedy the consequences, make it right, and try to do better next time.
There you go.
And so what we're here to do is to constantly recognize our failures and try to fix them through that. That's why we have Yom Kippur every year, that constant process of tshuva. Right.
So make tshuva every day of your life.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Constantly the ability to change and fix what you
So that's the rabbinic solution ultimately. Yeah. Okay. So this is still a big deal, though, as it relates to the Jewish framework for moral behavior, which, as we talked about, is mitzvot, the commandments. I would say, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Hanina, all would agree. We have the free will to choose to do mitzvot or not, free will or free won't. But they'd also agree we're obligated to do them as a result of our covenant with God made by our ancestors when they accepted Torah at Sinai. They're God's commands. They're God's stipulations to that contract that our ancestors signed on our behalf. So it creates this idea of commandedness that is binding across generations. We're going to talk more about mitzvot and their relationship to yetzer, our impulses, next week. Or at least I will. And it involves recognizing a commander, as it were, one who does the commanding, to whom one submits and agrees to obey. Mm-hmm. For us, we weren't at Sinai, but that commandedness transcends generations. The covenant was understood as being not just with those who stood there, but all generations to come. We all see ourselves as if we stood at Sinai, and it's within this framework of understanding ourselves as obligated, as having accepted the mitzvot, that we encounter this incredible, challenging drash in the Talmud in Shabbat daf 88a. And I'm just going to let you read it, just so you know. The translation here is pulled from the website Sfaria, and the way they do the translation, they sort of do an interlinear explanation. So everything that's in bold is translated literally from the Gemara text. Everything that's in regular typeface is basically added to make that make sense and explain on the way. If that makes sense. So there's some amount of, if it says it in the non-bold, know that that's an editorial hand at work, and what's bold is what's actually there. But Rachel, you're up. Do you mind reading the drash for us?
The Gemara cites additional homiletic interpretations on the topic of the revelation.
They've been doing a bunch before, and here's one. Okay.
At Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
The Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mount, B'tachtit Hahar. Rabbi Abdimi bar Chama bar Chassa said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath Tachat, the mountain, and the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub, and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent, and if not, there will be your burial.
All right, pause there for a second. Are we comprehending what's happening here? He's drashing on the tachtit, which literally does mean like the base of the mountain.
Right.
We would understand that to be the foot of the mountain. But he's saying that tachtit actually there, it sounds like tachat, which can also mean under. So he's reading this as that it means the Jews stood under the mountain. And God held it above them, flipped it over like a bathtub, I guess, and said, if you accept, great, and if not, you're going to die here. I think I read this as implying I'm going to drop a mountain on you.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone else is getting the same thing. Okay.
Right.
What sort of consequences do you see of this arising from this drash?
Not a heck of a lot of free will.
Okay, so
Yeah,
perhaps
right.
not. Can the people have been considered to have chosen to follow the mitzvot of their own free will if there was a mountain being held over their heads?
This is one.
Susan says no. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. This is one rabbinic. This is by no means like the rabbinic, interpretation. We'll get some alternatives in a moment. But this is clearly a big problem. This is still an authentic interpretation. We established that someone who is coerced or otherwise not given a choice can't be morally responsible for their actions. We can't have chosen to do the mitzvot. We were coerced into this contract. Therefore, we might not be obligated.
That's right.
But another way,
Yeah.
I think of one other way possibly is,
Okay.
it's sort of a comment. It's just he's showing his power and majesty to them. It helps them make the choice
Mhm.
that this is not just a fear of death,
Mhm.
maybe, but that he has this power. It is right to respect him and his power, and it makes their choice easier that this is a legitimate thing to do.
So what comes after this, which I didn't bring today, I want to save it for Shavuot, actually. Reish Lakish brings another solution to this, which doesn't read this as coercive, reads it as essentially part of. This was what Rabbi Abdimi is saying is the Jews' purpose, essentially. They were created to be mitzvot doers,
Right.
and so failure to do that and buy into that project is just a negation of their purpose. And it's not like it's not a coercion. It's just a statement of reality. You're either doing it. You're neither doing your created purpose, or that's it. You have no purpose in your.
If you jump off the
essentially
cliff, you will die. And that's not a punishment. That's just
Right.
a natural consequence.
Right. So Reish Lakish reads it that way, which is very interesting. We'll do some Shavuot learning on that, but let's keep reading because the next two voices clearly do read this as coercion. You want to keep reading, please?
Rav Acha bar Yaakov said, "From here, there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it is therefore not binding."
Cool. So exactly what we said. This
Yeah.
potentially very traumatic for the mitzvah. Onward.
Rava said, "Even so, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Ahasuerus, as it is written. The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. And he taught. The Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Sinai."
Wow.
So this is not only good Shavuot Torah, it's also good Purim Torah in the positive sense, not
It's
the
the first
silly
place
sense.
in the Tanakh where the word "din" is used,
Mhm.
and also "dat v'din" in the Megillah.
Right.
Religious customs and religious law are used for the first time. Rabbi Chaim Seidlerfeller gave a talk on this passage about 10 years ago in Eugene about the second acceptance of the Torah with Achashverosh at that time, and it's reaffirmed.
Yeah. So we're clear on what Rava is trying to say here, that he's essentially saying, yes, Rabbi Abdimi was right. This was coercion. I'm reading this Rashi as God holding the mountain and saying,
Yeah.
accept or die. but it's okay for us because we live after the era of the Jews of Shushan and Achashverosh, who, even though they were coerced and not bound by the mitzvah at that time, nonetheless took it upon themselves. They were essentially acting as if up to that point, and their affirmation at that point, which was totally a matter of free will, now makes a binding upon us.
Could it be that these people fresh out of slavery had to be treated like children? And, we tell children, yeah, you will do this.
That's one of
And then when they grow up,
Yeah.
then they can
That's
make choices.
I think that's parallel to what I think these rabbis think is going on here. I mean, I think this still creates some pretty significant challenges. What about all the intervening generations? Were they all unbound, not bound to mitzvah? What were they doing? I think this is still, potentially problematic, and that's why I like Rish Lakish's take on it to follow this. But this is all to show you that this is how the rabbis went about wrestling with the problem of free will, understanding that even though the mitzvot are obligatory upon us, it's essential that there be an element of autonomy in choosing to perform them. Heteronomy is tolerable up to a point. It seems like within the rabbinic imagination, but still there essentially needs to be an authenticity, I think, although not exactly that sense, an authentic choice. Yeah, a true choice in order to
go back to the slave mentality. We could talk about how that they evolved past that, in terms of the self evolves past the slavery mentality. But I have heard Orthodox people say, there is no question. I take on all the mitzvot. I take the yoke of the Torah, Ol Mochut Shemayim. Solomon Schechter in the 19th century wrote an essay called "The Joy of the Yoke," where you have the joyous acceptance of the commandments, responding to his Christian critics, right? Oh, you Jews suffer with the yoke, right? It's a burden. I hear this a lot, about the mitzvah.
Certainly the Christian polemic against the Jews,
even among Jews.
Yeah.
So the evolution away from the slave mentality is important. And yet I hear Orthodox Jews saying, and those who take the full kit and caboodle, the whole thing, I willingly, joyfully take on the entire set of commandments. That's my job as a Jew, to be fully obligated, to do it with joy, but I don't question. I serve the Lord. The Lord is in charge. And I've heard Orthodox Jews who are articulate explain their choice of lifestyle and relationship to God in terms of taking on the entire set of mitzvah and to live up to them the best they can. I was in that world for many years.
So that's where at least I plan to go in our next session, talking about mitzvot and whether it is a form of heteronomy, whether that is really a choice or not, it's important to examine some of these fundamental issues. I think at the beginning, because these questions about personhood and moral responsibility get actually, like you could tell, to the very foundation of Judaism as a religious framework. Like this has consequences that go all the way to that Sinai moment. There's tension in between what we understand makes us persons, our ability to choose, and also God's power in the universe as we understand it in a religious framework. And I think the fact that you brought up so many folks who, and I've been reading Yeshayahu Leibowitz on this. So this idea drives a lot of the evolution of Jewish theology and thought over the past 2 millennia. The question is how can we continue to do the mitzvot? How can we be freely choosing them when we also sort of understand them as not something chosen?
Well, especially a mitzvah we don't like.
Right, exactly, and especially
immoral mitzvah,
like
cherem,
right,
obliterating an entire village, in the name of God. The Agagite king.
Right.
I mean, killing people and ethnic cleansing in Deuteronomy is not something even the rabbis were congruent with. They had problems with that too, although some supported it. What do we do with mitzvot that are clearly contradictory to our ethical norms of today?
Yeah.
So that's liberal Judaism wrestles with that right now.
So more there next week.
Orthodoxy. So very good.
Yes. Any other closing thoughts or lingering questions?
Mr. Koch,
Yasher Koach, thanks so much. That was
thank you all.
an honor to
Yasher
teach in
Koach to both
teach
of
in
you.
memory
Yeah,
of
thank
your
Yes,
your late rabbi and
yeah, we all should do the dance between as Hanan. He would go.
you heard it here. We're gonna go.
Hopefully
we're gonna
not
go
naked,
dance naked in
not
the
in this
woods.
weather.
No, not this weather. Maybe when it's 105 degrees.
All right.
But,
Thanks, friends. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, hope we can
So
edit
my
that
brother-
out.